Good evening. Tonight we're continuing our study of the book of Genesis, and with all its many aspects and all its depth and multiple authors. And we're talking for the first few weeks about the authorship system. And once we get into the stories, I'll point out after a while, you'll be able to tell me who's the writer. And in order to figure this out, I'm using a theory that was the dominant one until the 1960s, I'd say, and which is called the documentary hypothesis. And I'll outline it in a minute. But I do want to say it's not the only theory of authorship of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible and beyond. There are others, but the others at this point are really growing in response to the documentary hypothesis. And they are so varied and so mixed and so terribly confusing that for a class like this, which is not primarily in who wrote what, but focusing on the stories, I want to stick with the documentary theory, which was prominent until recently, as a way of explaining who wrote this material. And I said that those who worked that theory out came up with 4 letters to identify the writers. The J document, written between 950 and 850 BCE in Jerusalem, which is one reason we call it J. And Jerusalem, remember, was in the southern part of Israel. And then the E document, which was written in the north. And one of the names of the north is Ephraim or Ephraim. That's one reason we call it E. There are other reasons. The J document is called the J document because the name for God, which you will see translated Lord, is Yahweh, however that was pronounced. In those days, there was a W in Hebrew. But since those who worked out this theory were German scholars, it would be Jahweh. The Yah sound would be J. So this is the J document because they used the name for God, Yahweh or Jahweh. I'm avoiding pronouncing it because in our Jewish tradition, it is the unsayable name, so holy that it is never to be. You can write it with consonants, Yud He Vav He, but only in a document that is then preserved and never discarded. It becomes a holy document because it has the name on it. But you're not supposed to say it. But you can figure out how it sounded from the spelling, or the closest we can guess. That's another reason to call the J document J, and that name is inaccurately translated as Lord. And the reason I say inaccurate is that Lord isn't a personal name, but that name was believed by the ancient Israelites to be the personal name of God, like John or Harry, and only they knew it. And this indicated their intimacy with God. Hence the J document, its location and its word for God. The E document was written in the north. Now you have to remember a little bit of Israelite history here, that David became king in 1000 BCE. My students were always grateful to him because that was one date they could remember. And 1000 BC, that's not hard. And he founded the great kingdom of Israel, which spread from Lebanon to Egypt and across the Jordan into present-day Jordan and Syria. Quite an empire for a small people. And it's one reason he's remembered with such fondness as the ideal king, at least in his public life. You get into private lives, that's something else. Well, no man's perfect. He became king in 1000 BCE. He built his capital in Jerusalem for the same reason that we built ours in Washington, D.C. This country, from the very beginning, was divided between North and South, even when you had slavery all over the country. But forgive me for the cough drop, but I had some kind of a heavy cold this week, and the cough remains and makes it difficult for me to talk without, I don't want to erupt in coughs. So the drop is better than that, but I hope it'll get me through this without coughing at you. The country split in half. It wasn't small enough. You want to shake these people and say, are you people crazy? You're splitting this tiny little country into two? Well, that's what happened. David built his capital in Jerusalem in 1000 BCE. It's right on the border between North and South. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. It was called the Kingdom of Israel and Judah. The tribe of Judah was by far the largest one, and it dominated the south. The southern half of the country was almost entirely the tribe of Judah. And that, shouldn't be any surprise, was the tribe of David, the most populous, the most influential tribe. They produce a king. And from 1000 BC until 586, until 722 BCE, the nation was united. Difficulties between North and South, as there were in our country before the war between the states. Between the revolution and the war between the states, Southern and Northern rivalries were very much in the forefront of trying to build one country here. And it wasn't so easy. So the ancient Israelites had exactly the same problem. Northern Israel and Southern Judah. And their interests didn't always coincide. And finally, they broke in half. David had a son, the great Solomon, who built the temple and built, if we can believe the descriptions in the book of Kings, he was a master builder, glorious temple, and palaces, and a hall of columns where he met ambassadors from all around the world, and his jewels and his gold and his silver, and they go on and on about it. He must have been known for that, and his wisdom, of course. He uttered many proverbs, and a great king. However, one must ask just how great he was if the minute he died, the country split in half. His idiot son, Rehoboam, was not able to hold the two parts of the country together. And without the great wise Solomon, it split in two. And one of Solomon's generals, named Jeroboam, became king of northern Israel. They declared a new country, and they had a series really of what we today would call military dictators who declared themselves king. In the south, in Judah, they remained loyal to the Judean king of the tribe of Judah and believed that the king had to be of the tribe of Judah. Well, you now have two countries, Israel in the north of Jerusalem, and everything south of Jerusalem, Judah, or later called Judea. Well, with the country split in half, it was open to attack from all kinds of larger empires that surrounded them. And one was the Assyrian Empire. And in 722 BCE, the Assyrians came down like the wolf on the fold as Byron said in his great poem, The Destruction of Sennacherib. They came down on northern Israel, and their way of dealing with conquered people was especially cruel. In order to make sure that these people never thought of themselves as a nation again and would dare to rebel against the great Assyrian emperor, they would take the people and scatter them around the great Assyrian empire, which was all over the Middle East. There were 12 tribes of Israel, you recall. Judah and Benjamin were in the south, but in the north were the other 10. Those 10 tribes became the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They were scattered throughout the Middle East. Some scholars believe that we're just beginning to discover who they are, their distant descendants, today. This is a very exciting undertaking. What happened to them? 10 lost tribes. They fell out of history, leaving only Judah. So from 722 BCE until 586 BCE, only little Judah, the territory around Jerusalem, certainly couldn't call it an empire now, it's just a small country, but they held on. And they held on very importantly because our whole monotheistic tradition depends upon their ability to hold on. Now, they weren't as monotheistic as the prophets might have wanted them to be, because we have discovered little statues about that high all over ancient Israel. People had household gods. When they moved into the promised land, came across the Jordan after Moses died, 1250 BCE, 1200 BCE. Well, between 1250 and 1200. And under Joshua, they swept into Israel and settled down after having a series of wars with other peoples. The idea was to establish a monotheistic society. Apparently, that's what the leaders wanted to do. But the people, I mean, suppose you're an ordinary Israelite. By this time, you're not a shepherd anymore. You want to be a farmer. And you come into a new country, a land of milk and honey, a great place to have a farm. And you move in. And unlike the claims of parts of the book of Joshua, they didn't wipe out all those Canaanites. The Canaanites were living among them. And many of them joined up to be Israelites because they saw the might and power of the God of Israel. You moved in, and Mr. and Mrs. Canaanite, who had the next farm, would visit you, say, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. I guess your God is stronger than our God because you've beaten us, and so we might as well make peace with it. But you know who really owns this land is the god Baal, B-A-A-L, the fertility god, and his heavenly girlfriend, Ashtarte. And every spring we have sex orgies in order to honor them. The whole religion was expressed in wild sexuality. The Israelites were pretty straight-laced. Now as then, perhaps, respectable people. But you mean that the God we brought with us, not the only God we should worship, the one God? Well, maybe there isn't one God. What about Baal? We've had wonderful crops every year because we pray to Baal. And so the average Israelite he still believed that God was God. But meanwhile, if you want to have a good rain, you pray to the God of rain. And if you want to have good soil, you have that God over here. And the sunshine God is over there. They weren't taking any chances. So just how monotheistic the average Israelite was is questionable. But the leaders certainly were, most of the time. And the prophets, at least, were trying to They were always crying out against polytheism because most people were polytheistic. You don't denounce something that isn't a problem. And even the great Solomon married many women. He made alliances with kings all over the Middle East, and those women were given their own palaces in Jerusalem and the ability, the right to worship their own gods. And in fact, the writer of the Torah says that's why Solomon's kingdom fell. There are always religious explanations for everything. Solomon's kingdom may have fallen because of political stupidity of his son and other things, but he shouldn't have allowed. Well, you see, he too had a problem. You want to make an alliance with the king of Egypt. That may seem strange because we've been slaves in Egypt, but things are different now. These are different Egyptians. They want to make an alliance with the king in Jerusalem. So he marries an Egyptian princess. Well, if you marry an Egyptian princess, as Solomon did, don't you think she has a right to bring her gods with her? And that's what happened in Jerusalem, even in the highest level. There was always a problem. Monotheism is a very unusual idea. There is only one invisible spiritual force behind, within, and behind and beyond everything else. It's much more obvious to worship the sun or to worship the water or to worship Mother Earth. But the Israelites came up with this idea, and it didn't win over a lot of people very quickly. It might have taken 1,000 years to finally take hold. So, all right. The kingdom splits after Solomon dies, and that's only after 80 years since David was crowned. And now you have two kings and two countries. It's like North and South Korea, same people, but North and South, but divided by an ideology. And one was loyal to the house of David, and the other was very angry at the house of David for a variety of reasons. They felt that Solomon, wise as he was supposed to be, had really run the country for his own native tribe of Judah and had neglected the northern tribes. So they were angry at him and ready to rebel and secede from the Union when he died. So that's what happened. Leaving the country vulnerable, now you have two little countries. And the result was the Assyrians swept away the northern tribes of Israel in 722 BC. And what happened? The intellectuals of northern Israel, who had produced the E-scroll, produced their own version of the Bible, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's stories. They fled from the Assyrian invasion, and they fled south to Jerusalem. They may not have cared much for their Jewish cousins in Jerusalem, but they were a hell of a lot closer to them than they were to the Assyrians. So they brought their sacred scroll, which we now call the E document. E because it's from Ephraim, which is another name for the north, and because it uses the name Elohim for God, which is not a name, it's a generic, it means God. So when you see, now this would be simple if we could open the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and you would see J, E, and others. But it's not so simple, they're all mushed together. If, when the Assyrians swept down on northern Israel, the intellectual class with its sacred scrolls came south, sometime around 700 BCE, we believe that some scribe combined the J and the E scrolls. So now they're all mushed up together. And it's fortunate for someone like me because you need a trained person to pull them apart. And it's not so easy. When it says Lord, it's probably J. When in the next paragraph, it tells a similar story, but using the term God, it's probably E. Well, what do you do when it says Lord God? Huh? Problems. You've got to analyze every sentence and make a judgment. And they're just preliminary judgments, even after all this time, because although we've had these sacred texts for 3,000 years, that doesn't mean that we've been studying them in any kind of modern scholarly way, except for the last 200 years, 250, that's all. When people began to ask the question, how can it say that in Noah's flood, the animals went in 2 by 2? And in the next paragraph, it says they went in 11 by 11. This paragraph uses the term Lord. This one uses God. This one uses certain Hebrew phrases you don't see in the other one. This one suggests that the flood was created by improper sexual activity. The other text says, no, it was violence. Sex and violence, everybody's favorite things. But what caused the flood? There is no definitive answer because you've got 2 flood stories. And by the way, the alternative in this case isn't E, but P, which we'll get to in a minute, because we have to deal with the P source too. So with the Abraham stories, you'll get one account of how God called Abraham to be the great prophet to the world and to found the people Israel and be the monotheistic high father. And there's another account in the next paragraph, much less elaborate, talking about the same thing. And we finally got it through our heads that it's not one person writing this whole thing, Moses or anybody else. You've got 2 accounts of the same events. Well, these are probably 2 accounts written much later, in which the imagination of the writer goes, this writer goes in this direction, and this writer goes in that direction. And they're both trying to create the most dramatic story. J usually succeeds. The most dramatic story is usually written by J. J wrote the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story. Surely the greatest foundational text we have. But before you get to J, you're dealing with P, and I'll talk about him in a moment. The introduction to the whole Bible is the 6-day creation story, and how different that is from the J story of the Garden of Eden. And we talked about that a little last week. The same person couldn't have written both stories. So you've got J written in the South, the most dramatic, very sexy stories, the most intimate, the most human, some of them quite long and very insightful. Then you've got E, which tells similar stories, but much more directly and much shorter. And then let's talk about, so that's in the North. So they have the Northern Sacred Book and the Southern Sacred Book, and 700 BC, the Northern scholars and Southern scholars get together, and the thing is pieced together. So now you have one paragraph of J, one of E, one of J, one of E. Gets complicated. Now we have to talk about P. If the nation of Israel split in half after Solomon's death in 920 BC or something like that, other things happened to it. Northern Israel was swept away in 722 BC. The 2 texts, J and E, were amalgamated around 700 BC. But the history went on. Now you have Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, trying to hold out against these vast empires and not doing it very well militarily, but doing it very well intellectually. Because where is the religion of the Moabites today? Where is the religion of the Hittites? Where is the religion of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all the ones who swept the Jews away over and over and over again? What happened to those great empires? Gone with the wind. Their language, their religion, their culture, all gone. And yet, Israel remains. I mean, the people Israel, which sometimes takes a national form, as it does in the Middle East today, and sometimes not. But here are the Jews, and here are the Christians who come out of the Jews, and the Muslims. There is a clever paragraph that I have in mind as I've been talking to you called Where Are the Hittites? And a modern writer, not Jewish, says, I was just in New York. An awful lot of Israelites. Where are the Hittites? Where are all these great empires? Who conquered whom? Exactly who conquered whom? Well, good question. So let's go on with the history. The nation of Judah held out until 586 BCE, between 722 and 586, all alone, battered from every side, and eventually the Babylonians did it. They swept down on Jerusalem. They destroyed the great temple of Solomon. Excuse me. They burned it, tore down the walls, and kidnapped the middle class, the upper class, anyone with any talent of any kind, took them to Babylonia. They didn't scatter them the way the Assyrians had done, thank God. They took them as a group to Babylonia, where they allowed the Jews, as they now call them, it just means Judean, they allowed the Jews to live in separate Jewish villages if they wanted to be led by their own religious leaders, to follow their own religious practices. And if they wanted to believe in one God, fine. The Babylonians didn't care as long as they were productive citizens of the Babylonian Empire and did not try to have any political independence. They did what they were told politically. They could have total religious and cultural freedom. Well, the Jews were in Babylon, in the great Babylonian captivity, as it's called, from 586 BC to 538 BC. And then in 538 BC, the growing power of Persia eclipsed Babylon, and the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, said, anyone captive in Babylonia can go home. Rebuild your shrines and temples and pray for me. Cyrus wasn't taking any chances. He wanted everyone praying for him. And he didn't know which was the right religion. Or maybe they were all right. What a thought. And he said, go home and pray for me. And a number of Jews started a series of pilgrimages back from Babylonia to Jerusalem. These are the hardiest, most intrepid souls, because most Jews either stayed in Babylon, where they had grown quite comfortable over 50 years, learning how to be a minority religion in a majority culture, which wasn't easy. But once they figured it out and began new institutions, perhaps the synagogue as we know it, the local house of worship upon which the local churches are based today, where you offered up prayer and read holy scriptures and sang hymns instead of having animal sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. The religion shifted completely over those 50 years. And by the time of Jesus' day, you had synagogues all over the countryside and in every town and village where it says he went to worship there, although he was hostile to the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, in the temple, animals were being sacrificed. Totally different religion than what was going on in the synagogues. Just as before the Babylonian exile, you didn't have one Israelite religion. You had the religion of the priests, the temple cult, in which animal sacrifice was crucial, daily sacrifice. And then you had the religion of the prophets. Jeremiah went to the temple and told people not to come. God doesn't want animal sacrifice. You must be the temple. Your heart must be the temple. And your life is what you sacrifice up to God to live a righteous life, rather than just do whatever you feel like doing. Totally different notion of religion. And yet the prophetic Judaism and the temple Judaism, if you want to call it Judaism, both lived at the same time. Just as you couldn't, how do you define the Christian religion today? Is it the Eastern Church? Is it the Roman Catholic Church? Is it the many Protestant churches? There's not one definition. Why did Christ have to shed his blood on the cross for us? Paul's notion that he has to pay the penalty for original sin that we inherit from Adam is one notion, the dominant one. But there are other ideas which had nothing to do with that, which explain the crucifixion very differently. It's still Christian because Jesus is the center of the religious conception, and his birth and death are crucial. But what was the purpose of them? What did they accomplish? That's up for different interpretation. So even today, it would be folly to try to define Christianity in a sentence or two. Same thing with Judaism. Orthodox Judaism is often one corner, Reform in another. Are they the same religion? A lot of people don't think so. And yet all these people call themselves Jews. So first you had prophetic versus priestly Judaism. Then after the exile, when Jews began to trickle back to Judea and rebuild Jerusalem, you had synagogue Judaism. And for years, they didn't rebuild the temple until in 520 BC, they decided to build it. And now you had animal sacrifice in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, but prayer and hymn singing and Bible reading in synagogues all over the country. Again, two different kinds of Judaism. So that's what happened. They went back and they slowly reformed their religion. But remember, at the time of Jesus, one of the most interesting statistics is that 80% of Jews of the world did not live in Palestine. They were already scattered all the way around the Mediterranean basin as far as Spain. In Rome and Alexandria, all along what are now Arab countries in North Africa, there were Jews. Only 20% were in Jerusalem. What a difference from what it had been earlier. Well, so the scattering of the Jews began in 586 BC, really. And it's been ever since then, the majority of Jews have lived all around the world. So living as a Jewish American or a Jewish Frenchman is just as natural to Judaism as being a citizen of the state of Israel. This is how we've lived for 2,000 years. And again, Christians are also scattered all over the world for a reason. I believe that God needs us to build his kingdom everywhere, not just in one corner of the world. So we are both witness people, called to build the kingdom of God in the human community. That's what Jews and Christians do. And not so easy. So we read the Bible, help us out. When we find our ancestors didn't have it easy either. All right, so, but let's stop in Babylon for the next segment here. The Jews get to Babylon 586 BC, the great majority of them. And what are they going to do? There's no temple. And it's said in the book of Deuteronomy, which they believed was written by Moses. It's another book. We're not going to deal with that right now. You cannot sacrifice animals except in the place where I have caused my name to dwell. And although it doesn't say Jerusalem, Jews at that time believed that's what it meant. Therefore, in Babylon, we can't build a temple and sacrifice animals. We can only do that back in Jerusalem, and we ain't there. So what are we going to do instead? We're going to invent an alternative institution, the synagogue, which just means house of assembly, house of getting together. And instead of having a priest of the blood of Aaron, the high priest had to be of a certain bloodline, we'll just have scribes who are literate people. Now, it's debatable whether the average Jew could read. The ideal was, yes, because you had to read the Torah, the text. Judaism is a text-based religion. So it may be the case that the ancient Jews actually accomplished something the ancient Greeks dreamt about, having something like, well, let's say widespread male literacy in terms of reading. But writing remained a professional skill. So you had a class of people, you always needed them to copy sacred text, who were called scribes or writers. And so the scribe, the trustee of the whatever text they had at that time, became the teacher of the community, and the word for teacher is rabbi. So the development of the institution of the rabbi, I think, had its roots in Babylon between 586 and 538 BCE. And also, so the synagogue, the rabbi, and instead of animal sacrifice, you had prayer, repentance, and righteousness. So a new kind of Judaism emerged out of necessity in Babylon, or else they would have disappeared. Instead, they remade themselves over 50 years. Religions have to be resilient like that. So, meanwhile, there is a group, perhaps a disaffected group, in Babylon that's out of work. They are the hereditary priests who spent their lives offering sacrifices according to minute rules at the altar of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. These fellows are out of work. They have been forcibly retired by the Babylonian army. They've got nothing to do. And what do clergy people do when they retire? They write books. 40 years a Presbyterian minister in Kansas, things like that. And once in a while, the book is going to be good. And these people did a pretty good job, because in retirement in Babylon, unable, because of their own doctrines, to go on offering animal sacrifices any place but Jerusalem, they picked up their pen and parchment, and they spent those years writing detailed descriptions of just how you offer the sacrifice of various animals on the altar in Jerusalem. Well, there was no altar in Jerusalem, but they had faith that once they got back there, the Lord would bring them back to begin with and enable them to rebuild that temple. And they believed that was valid Israelite faith. You had to have those animals killed to repent the sins of the people, or for various reasons. So they wrote it all up, which is why when you start reading the Torah on your own, you get through Genesis very nicely, wonderful stories. You get halfway through Exodus. Moses goes up on the mountain, he comes down with the 10 Commandments, and stop. At that point, you have an elaboration of laws and more rules and more regulations of how to offer sacrifices. From the middle of Exodus, all through Leviticus, to the middle of Numbers. What happened was the priests wrote this big volume of material. And at some point, they took their scissors and just cut through the book of Exodus, opened it up, and dropped their priestly stuff there, and then they sewed it up. And so you go from an adventure story with Moses and the tribes of Israel in the desert trying to fight off all these people who were trying to destroy them, and then God, in his infinite grace, gives them the 10 Commandments, and Moses comes down from the 10 Commandments from the mountain. But the people have corrupted themselves with a golden calf, and he throws down the tablets. I remember when I was 13, the third row of a great theater in New York, watching the recently released 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. And when Charlton Heston threw those fiery tablets down, my brother and I in the third row were looking straight up. We were terrified. We thought they'd hit us. And then when the Red Sea split, oh my God, what a spectacle. But the story just stops. And that's P. All that material that the retired priests wrote down about the sacrifices in the temple, all of that is P. And it is of interest to scholars, but much less interest to the layman who wants to hear the adventure stories in Genesis, Exodus. And then in the middle of Numbers, the story just takes up again. You go from like sentence A, and then it stops, and then it picks in the sentence A in the middle of Exodus, and then sentence B right after it is now suddenly in the middle of Numbers, which have gone through 2 books in between, and pages of reading. So that has to be deciphered. So that's the P scroll. The third scroll is the priestly scroll, P for priests, produced in Babylon. According to this documentary theory, it's the third document. And it's also all mixed up here with J&E, because the last editor of this material may very well have been a man named Ezra. And if it wasn't Ezra, it was someone like him. Ezra was a priest, both a hereditary priest and a scribe in Babylon. And at some point, people think it could be 450 BCE. He gets on his camel with a whole group of people, a delegation. He puts the Torah, the 5 books of Moses as we know them today, which he has redacted, he's the editor, puts them in his saddlebags, takes them to Jerusalem, reads them to the people, and the people say, all this will we obey. And from then on, loyalty to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, defines what a Jew is. Now, I said 5 books. I haven't mentioned the 5th yet, which plays no part in this course, but I'll just mention. J, E, D, and P. In 620 BCE, under King Josiah, a very righteous and good young man who was king of Israel and died young in battle, unfortunately. Josiah said, it's time to clean up the temple. We've got to refurbish it. After all, it goes all the way back to Solomon, 300 years. And during the refurbishing, it's a wonderful story. Josiah sends his secretary, Shaphan, over to the temple to pay the workers for the work of that week. And he has a money box with him, and he's going to give it to the high priest, and then he'll distribute it to the workers. And he gets there, and the high priest is all in a dither. And he says, well, I brought the money from the king. Oh, I forget that. Look at this. And he shows him a scroll. And it seems to be a series of speeches by none other than Moses himself. Speeches to the Israelites during the 40 years wandering in the desert, between the exodus from Egypt and the entrance into the promised land. By Moses. Wow. This book is 600 years old, and we must obey it. And that's the book of Deuteronomy, or some part of it, we believe. The book of Deuteronomy, the claim is it was written by Moses in 1250 BC. In fact, it was produced probably by the priests of Jerusalem or some other priests around 650 BC, and then rediscovered some years later and declared to be a fifth, another book of Moses. But there is no D material, Deuteronomic material, in what we're going to be reading. So we don't have to consider that now. I just wanted to tell you that there are those 5 books, and they developed the J scroll, 850 BC, the E scroll, 750 BC, the D scroll, the speeches of Moses, maybe 650 BC. And the final thing with all the priestly material, maybe 450 BC. So here we have the Torah, a document with 4 major schools of authors over a period of many hundreds of years. And that material runs, to make it even more confusing, it doesn't just stop with the Torah, it runs right into the stories of Joshua and Judges. And there you also have the different sources. J ends with the crowning of David. And to the J author who is loyal to David's monarchy, this is the crowning moment of the history of the world. He began with Adam and Eve, and he ends with David on the throne. And E is more nationalistic. It doesn't begin with the creation. E begins with the Abraham stories. Some of the Abraham stories are J and some are E. And they skip back and forth. And as we read them, we'll notice the difference. And then, so you have to know J and E to see who wrote the Torah, the 5 books, and Genesis, which is what we're doing here. And so J and E are in Genesis, but so is P, very liberally represented by the introduction. And that's the 6-day story in which every day is good. And when God finishes the 6-day creation, he looks down and he says, it's very good. Notice he puts an ethical value on it. A very similar story among the Cheyenne Indians, in which their great spirit also creates the world in stages. Every stage, every day, he says how beautiful it is. And at the end, he says, how very beautiful. So it's an aesthetic tale rather than an ethical tale. From the biblical point of view, to say something is beautiful usually means it's ethically beautiful. This person has done a beautiful thing. When the woman anoints Jesus for his burial the night before in the suburb of Bethlehem, and the disciples get angry and say, though, that bottle of nard that she used to comb his hair out could have been sold for $300 and the money given to the poor. Jesus says, be quiet, she's done something beautiful for me. So when he meant beautiful, he meant beauty of the soul. He didn't mean Marilyn Monroe beautiful. And that's the way the Bible usually uses it. And when you mess that up and you misunderstand it, you end up with trouble. God wanted Samuel to find a king. And Samuel had never been a hunter of kings before. So he puts on his king hunting outfit and he goes out to find a king for Israel. And he chooses because of physical beauty. Saul was a full head taller than anyone else in Israel. He was extremely handsome. And this young man was anointed by Samuel because he looked kingy. He looked like a king. Well, Saul ends up with mental problems. And at the end of his 20-year reign, things are worse than they were in the beginning. And God says, now look, Samuel, you've got to get it right this time. I'm going to send you out to find another king. But this time, do not look at the beauty of his countenance or the height of his head, because God does not see as man sees. God looketh upon the soul, upon the heart. Find me a man with the heart of a king, and I don't care what he looks like. And David is described as very beautiful, but he's a little fellow. Napoleon conquered Europe. He was belittled in military school because he, as a dwarf, didn't stop him from conquering Europe, did it? So there are outer kings and inner kings. And that distinction, I mean, it's not just about finding kings, it's about finding kings among men and women. Noble people, kind people, loving people, compassionate people. That's what you look for, not physical beauty. That's the point of view of the Bible. And it has informed the entire history of our civilization. And it's what every one of you and I were brought up on. Good versus bad. This is the way father says or mother says to be a good human being. When other people are mocking someone who's different, you reach out to them, you be kind and say, that could be me. Just the gift of empathy, which has nothing whatever to do with physical appearance. That's not just an accident. That's not just, the world is not innately moral or immoral, or beautiful or not beautiful. It all depends on how human beings decide to interpret the world and say which is more important, one kind of beauty or another kind of beauty. And whether or not we have, as a civilization, followed this, with religion, the world is bad enough. Without it, I can't imagine how terrible it would be. At least we're given these guideposts of right and wrong and good and bad. That's what decent people learn from their parents. And that's what parents have to teach children. And that comes right from the Bible. It's an interpretation of life, because life doesn't interpret itself. It's our life, our human life. And the value of everything passes through us. All the paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Louvre have no value, except when human beings look at them. And then they're there waiting for us who know how to look at them to be moved and stirred by their beauty. Otherwise, they just sit there. In itself, nothing has any value that doesn't touch on the human. We give value to everything. God teaches it to us through the Bible and other means. We teach it to our children, and we find ourselves living in the world of good and evil. But we've made it that way. It's up to us to do that. So God has placed the future of the world in our hands. He can be our God only if we are his people, meaning people open to this larger vision of what humankind can accomplish when the kingdom of God shines forth undimmed, and all the cruelty and the avarice and the greed and the hatred and all the rest of it is swept away, like the demons that Jesus would drive out of people. Once those demons are gone, if they ever could possibly be gone, we'll see a different world. And that's what we're aiming at. I mean, the whole notion of progress is an invention of the Bible. The ancient religions, as worthy as they were, nature worship. Nature goes around in a circle, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer. The myth of the eternal return. When the Israelites came along, they said, no, we're going to discard that. And we're going to have a new image. It starts here with creation. And it's like a line. And up here is redemption, when the kingdom of God shines forth for everybody to see. And somewhere on this line are us. And our job is to push upward toward that consummation. A completely different model, not circular, but linear. And that is the invention of progress. And if we can put our hands into the hands of God and move up that path, we're going in the right direction. So it's our job, as I said at my brother's funeral. My brother was a good man who made a difference and left the world a better place than he found it. And may that be said of us and of all of us. That's our job, to push toward the establishment of God's kingdom. Will it ever come? I don't know, but it's the ideal. It makes us keep walking and walking and walking. And that's all from the Bible. And from the book of Genesis, you'll find all these concepts. And then we spun them out over the last thousands of years. But this is the origin. And it's why we're still reading it. So, all right. You now have an idea, I hope, of the authorship theory. And I can give a few more examples to demonstrate it, but at this point, if there are any questions or comments, I would pause for them.
Does anybody have any questions or comments they want to unmute?
If something I said is not clear, then if you don't understand it, it's probable that others don't either. And I have to clarify. I don't want people falling through the cracks and saying, I don't know what he's talking about. I'm trying to make it clear, but I know it's a lot of material. And if it's new to you, it's a lot of material. Well, let me make a comment. Here we have two creation stories. One of them is a 6-day story, and the other one is a 1-day story. If you look at the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Or you can translate it, when God began the creating of the heaven and the earth, which makes more sense. Because if you have the old translation, it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, period. And the earth was a formless chaos. Chaos. The haaretz hayata tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu, a big mushed up mess. Now, if God just created the heaven and the earth, how can the earth be a totally messed up, chaotic place if the God of order just created it? Why would God create a mess and then out of the mess gradually make something in 6 days that made more sense? That's why the Hebrew allows you to read it this way. When God began the creating of the heaven and the earth was already a formless chaos, with darkness over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God swept over the face of the waters. And the Lord said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And that's the beginning of an orderly creation. But it means something very different from the first translation. It's not a matter of which one you pick. If you say, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," then you're suggesting there was God and nothing else. And then God made something out of nothing. No other ancient creation myth says that. Only the Hebrew one, if that's what it means. Creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. There's nothing, and then there's something. What is that? Or is it saying that not only God is eternal, but so is matter? When God began to create the heaven and the earth, matter, this kind of stuff out of which everything's made, was already there, but it was formless. So in this second reading, which is just the Hebrew, makes it just as possible to read it this way. What God did was not create something out of nothing. He imposed form. He imposed form on formless matter. All right, an inadequate example. Whether you ever saw your grandmother do this, or it's become part of the collective dream of humanity, your grandmother takes the dough and she takes the rolling pin and she rolls out the dough. And then she has her metal shapes, a star, a crescent, a circle, and she stamps the dough. She puts the star down, picks it up, puts it on a sheet, a grease sheet, and that's going to be a star-shaped cookie. She began with mush, with formless chaos, the dough, and she turns it into different things. She imposes form on matter. This is accordance with the Greek view that matter is eternal, form is eternal, and God is eternal, and form, in a sense, is in the mind of God. And God takes those forms in his head and he stamps them onto matter. This mush, this is going to be a tree. So he stamps a tree shape on it. This mush is going to be a human being. Does that. It's forming matter. The matter is eternal. The form or the ideal shape is eternal in the mind of God. That's what he has in his mind. And God is eternal. I think, and many scholars today would say, that the second translation is correct. When God began to form the heaven and the earth, this great mushmash was already there. And rather that then creates something out of nothing, he stamps the chaos with order. And the result, the Greeks said, the results are earth, air, fire, water. First, you have undifferentiated matter. Now, the cookie dough is a bad example because the cookie dough is not undifferentiated matter. It's already formed with the idea of cookie dough. And that's been formed on, we have never seen pure matter, even with electrons and all that. These are already shaped in the form of electrons. So it's only a theory that there was matter there before it began to be shaped, but there had to be. And everything's made out of it. And mysteriously, my hand and this computer and the bookcase behind me and the clock up there and the light in front of me, they're all made out of the same matter. But they're totally different, except they take up space. That's what matter does. So first you have chaotic matter, and then it's formed. And maybe that's what the first line of the Bible means. Not creation from nothingness, but imposing form on matter. So you really have a very different doctrine. One talks about the eternity of matter, and the eternity of form, and the eternity of God. And the other one just says God is there, and suddenly he goes, boo, and everything comes out of nothing. All right. We haven't the slightest idea how the world began. Big Bang Theory, whatever. These are the great stories we tell in order to explain it in a way that human beings can understand. So that's the first story, the 6-day story, and we're going to go through it in detail. Then suddenly in the second chapter, in the middle of a sentence, no less, it says, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heaven. In the day, one day, not 6 days. And this is the beginning of the Adam and Eve story by a totally different writer who in fact wrote that story, the J author wrote that story hundreds of years before the P author put in the 6-day introduction as wrapping up the whole package that Ezra put together as the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, or someone like Ezra. Not only do we see immediately that it's a 1-day creation, not a 6-day creation, we see that the attitude toward women is totally different. Now, this is crucial because we imagine these stories were written by men. How do men view women? Well, we talked about this a little last week. In the first story, whoever wrote those 6-day stories, whatever priestly writer wrote it, he must have had a great marriage and had a wonderful relationship with women, because it says in the 6th day, everything's moving up, creation's getting more and more complicated, progress. And in the 6th day, the crown of God's creation, God created humanity. Male and female, he created them. He created them to be his image on earth. That's in the 6-day story. Together. One doesn't help the other, they're partners. And they have to be partners in order to fulfill the first commandment, which is Peru or Vu, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Nobody's superior to anybody else. Both are needed. Total partnership. In the image of God. It repeats that 3 times. And we'll examine that. What could that possibly mean? And God created man in his image and in his likeness. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them 3 times. The Bible repeats something 3 times. It means pay attention. Maybe the most important idea in our civilization is that human beings are in the image of God. What does that mean? Infinite potentiality, goodness, tremendous power. What can it mean? The writer had some things in mind, but maybe we can spin it out for him. So that's the first story. The second story is so vastly different. First of all, it talks about man being created and then woman from man, a derivative being, there to be a helper to him, not to rule equally at all. And it's woman who gets man to eat the forbidden fruit. You better watch out for those women. There's a lot of, whoever wrote the Garden of Eden story with Adam and Eve had a lot of problems with women and had great insight into what happens when adolescent children begin to look beyond daddy for, well, when their sexuality begins to emerge. How does daddy feel? God in this case. Happy. The God in the first story, be fruitful and multiply. Go have all the sex you want, just have, and then I'll have grandchildren, and won't that be wonderful? And we'll populate the world. And the father in the Garden of Eden story, written hundreds of years earlier, is absolutely in distress when these children begin to grow up and away from him and try to make decisions on their own. Well, which is it? How can the same writer write both stories? They have a totally different attitude toward women, a totally different attitude toward sex, different attitudes toward what we're supposed to be doing in our lives. Is man basically good or bad? Well, we were made good, but we certainly messed that up. And if Adam disobeyed God, do we inherit that guilt? We inherit the consequence of his sin because there was a tree of life in the middle of the garden, as well as a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve were supposed to be immortal. But once they eat of the tree, that when they're saying we want to define good and evil and not wait for the old man for God to tell us. Once they do that, God can't afford to let them stay in Eden and eat of the tree of eternal life and become rival gods and centers of moral decision making. So he has to expel them. And here we are in a hard, cold world. Well, maybe not Charleston, but the rest of the world is, and everything that was given in the Garden of Eden, we now have to earn. But isn't this the eternal mythos in the heart of every human being? There was a time, I can't quite remember, but I have a feeling there was a time before time, when I was at rest and at peace and whatever I needed was given me. Well, that's being in the womb. We didn't even have to bother breathing. That's the Garden of Eden, the eternal colostrum. And how do you get out of there and establish yourself as a person, and then an adult person who can make moral decisions? Terrible trials and tribulations. Doing that. Just being born is terrifying. And then our parents take care of us. And then what? We're out on our own. During this season of holidays, I remember Thanksgiving, my childhood Thanksgivings, and Hanukkahs and Christmases, and how rich and wonderful those holidays were for a child. They were, in our house, child-centered holidays, especially Hanukkah and Christmas, where children got presents and the focus was on us. I was lucky enough as a greedy child to have a family where we celebrated Hanukkah and Christmas, so I got all the presents I wanted, and it destroyed my character, no question about it. But it's a time, I think of this holiday time as a time of great joy. And because I remember it as a child. Now I celebrate holidays. They're very important to me. I'll either have friends over to dinner or go over to somebody else's, and I go to synagogues and churches and get all involved in the Hanukkah season and the Advent season and Christmas. And what am I trying to get? What am I trying to recover? The Garden of Eden, that idyllic childhood that is in the heart of every one of us, and that we no longer quite have. And that's what these great stories are about. And poignantly, in the Jewish liturgy, when we stand before the ark, which has the scrolls of the Torah in it, we say, Chadesh Yamenu Kakedem, renew our days as of old. Oh Lord, bring it all back. Bring it back. The Garden of Eden, that time when everything was given. And what is our idea of heaven? The Jews call it Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. And here's a Christian hymn that everyone loves. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. We're walking and talking with God in the Garden of Eden. Is that what the future life holds for us? It would be wonderful. It's this great projection of the imagination, brings us back, renew our days as of old. The Garden of Eden in the future, if that's what heaven is, will be different from what it was, because we've gone through all of this long life of struggle and strife. And now we come back, but it's not quite the same. It can never be, because we're not the same. But do we enter into a kind of second naivete, a second childhood? A colleague of mine, a rabbi and theologian, said, in order to read the Bible, you have to enter a second naivete. And Jesus said, you must accept it as a child. Same thing. It's not a matter of whether these things ever happened or not. I'm not any kind of fundamentalist. I'm supposed to just sort of close my eyes and say, yes, all these magical things happen. You can believe it or not believe it literally, but the meaning of it is what has structured our civilization. And the yearning for that treasure. Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchantman in search of goodly pearls. And when he had found one pearl of great price, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hid in a field, which when a man finds, he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field. So there is that treasure. The field is here. And when we tell these wondrous stories, it's as if we're caressing, we're going into that cave in our heart and opening those chests full of gold and silver and just caressing them. And that's the jewels of our forgotten childhood, but remembered through these great myths and stories. So in this case, you see how different the two stories are. But we'll say they are both true, because they both tell us not about what happened a million years ago, who knows, but they tell us about ourselves and of our origins and of the meaning of our lives, which is why we're still writing them or reading them. Now, if the ancients took these stories literally, as fundamentalists would want you to do today, how could they have lived with two stories? If one is literally factual, then the other must be not. But I don't think they believed either one of them was a factual story. These are stories that we live with that tell us who we are. And you can get some of that information from the six-day story and some from the Garden of Eden story. And by the way, there are at least two other stories of creation in the Bible. One of our students sent in to Joe Stern a text from Proverbs in which it's one of the most stirring texts I know. Proverbs is full of little proverbs. Wake up early, work hard, be nice to your mother, and all this stuff. And then in the middle of this, it says, wisdom speaks. I am wisdom. And I was with God from the very beginning of the world. I was his consort. I was his template. And he looked to me as an architect looks to a template, and he created the world based upon what I told him and what I showed him. This was written, if you were in the beginning of the class, when we were doing the wisdom literature, we went over this, and I spent some time in this passage, which is so exciting. During that time, and we're talking about a few in late Old Testament Judaism, if you want to call it that, maybe 200 BC, 300 BC. You have the book of Proverbs and the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, Song of Songs, Proverbs, etc. And there was a belief that God had a female consort, as all the other gods did, and that before God created the world, he consulted with her, and she gave him wisdom, chachma in Hebrew. And it was a Greek idea, the goddess of wisdom, Sophia. The Greeks had the god Sophia. And this is just a Jewish version. Or maybe the Greek idea is a Greek version of the Hebrew idea. But it's stunning. She's talking directly to us in Proverbs. Joe, you sent that to me. If you can send it to everybody by next week, that would help if you can do that. What the student sent to you. And thank you, student. I don't remember exactly who sent it yet at the moment, but thank you. You brought that to mind. And I needed to be reminded of that. So there you have a completely different idea of the creation. It's not 6 days. It's not one day. It is somehow in the fullness of time, in some magical time, before time. God consults with this goddess. And it's hard to call her anything else but that. Is this a violation of strict monotheism? Yes. And during this period, this is how they elaborated the religion. And then there's a fourth creation story, which I'll just tantalize you with now, which you can find in Isaiah and Psalms, in which it says that God created the world by killing a chaotic dragon and splitting her body up and creating the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land and all of it. So did God create the world by splitting a fiery dragon of chaos up and chopping up her parts and making the world? There's a fourth theory. How could the ancient Israelites have lived with four totally different theories if they were asking themselves which in fact really happened? That's not a question they asked them. That's a modern question. With myth, what happens then happens all the time. We always stand at the parted waters of Sinai. Will we have the guts to take that first step? We always stand at the foot of Sinai. I mean, the parted waters of the Red Sea. Somebody had to take the first step through those waters. And it doesn't matter whether any of that ever happened. It happens all the time when I have to make major decisions for myself. Will I have the courage to do that? We all stand at the foot of Sinai and try to get an insight into the awesome wondrousness of creation as we see that fire coming out of that volcano. And out of that fire, Moses comes down with 2 tablets of stone, which create our civilization. These are wondrous tales. We call them myths. That doesn't mean they're not true. It means that they bear a truth higher than just a historical story. The birth of Jesus, 6,000 miles away and 2,000 years ago, is a lovely story if it's a historical fact or whatever. But when you see it as a myth, as a mythos, a larger than life story, you realize that when you go to church Christmas Eve, you can be remembering that wonderful story, or of Silent Night, Holy Night, or you can realize the child is born again in you. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Catch out our sin and enter in. Be born in me today. Unless I become the manger, then none of it really matters much for my life. It's just a virgin having a baby, a medical anomaly, so what? When I go to a Passover Seder, and I'm remembering what happened when my ancestors were liberated from Egypt, the point is only made if I feel liberated, if I feel that telling that story, I am free, freed from Pharaoh, freed from all the pharaohs that hold us back, and say, I'm going to be a free man and take responsibility for my life and not be a slave to any pharaoh outside or inside. That's the meaning of Passover and Christmas. So when you look at things as mythos, they happen all the time. A historical moment only happens once. So religion deals with mythos, with stories that, being larger than life, are big enough to contain life, because life is larger than life. Only when we reach out beyond ourselves, beyond where we are, to new possibilities, that's human life, and that's divine life, when God reached beyond himself and created the world. It's our nature to do that. And that maybe is one meaning of being in the image of God. Only when we reach beyond ourselves are we ourselves. So, sorry for getting into a sermon here, but the holidays put me in the mood. And every one of these stories, Sunday night at 7 p.m., I'm going to Grace Church Cathedral on Wentworth to see their wonderful service of lessons and carols. And I recommend it to you, put you in a great mood. I don't care what religion you are. I go from there to the Mormons, and then to the Reformed Jews and the conservative Jews. I love it all, the Eastern Orthodox Church and its glorious music. It's all saying the same thing. Be aware of the enormity around you, and that we're part of. I guess that's the message of religion, to see the ultimate context, which is God. All right, we will continue. Actually, I think we said enough about the authorship, although it's just skimming the surface. It's enough for this class, because we're focusing on Genesis. So I think, bring your Bibles, and we'll start doing it line by line, and with various commentaries from me, and I hope from you. You'll ask questions about what this means. Don't feel overwhelmed by the material. This is meant for the people. This is the Bible is for us, for all of us, not for an elite class of interpreters who tell us what it means. So have a great week, and enjoy the holiday season, and I will see you next Monday, same time and place. Good night.
Thank you, Michael.